What did it mean for Japanese troops, hardened in caves and tunnels, to suddenly face America's flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima? How could men who trained for bayonet charges and night infiltration withstand steel beasts that breathed fire into the very earth they hid within? And why did this moment, this collision of doctrine, terrain, and terror become one of the most defining and horrifying confrontations of the Pacific War? Remembered by survivors with a silence deeper than words, the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima offered no mercy to the Marines who landed on February 19, 1945, nor to the Japanese who defended it under Lieutenant General Tadamichi. The island was a fortress without a skyline, its defenses buried beneath the surface in tunnels that stretched for miles. Waves of U.S. Marines struggled forward, their boots sinking into ash-like grains that swallowed movement and momentum. Mount Suribachi loomed above them like a dark tooth, its slopes riddled with firing ports and concealed artillery. Machine guns spoke from invisible mouths, mortar echoed without smoke to betray their source, and every inch of ground seemed to bleed with unseen hostility. Veterans later recalled that there was no safe direction, no reliable cover, only the grim understanding that the enemy watched from the earth itself. Yet the Japanese infantry, disciplined and resolute, believed the tunnels would shield them from the inevitable American assault, trusting that their concealed positions and interlocking fields of fire would turn the landing into a slaughter. What they did not yet understand was that a new threat was coming, one that rendered their strongest defenses into tombs. The battle's opening days were defined by shock, attrition, and grinding advance. Unlike earlier Pacific landings where Japanese defenders counterattacked at the waterline, Kuribayashi forbade wasteful charges, conserving his men for a battle of endurance. Marines moved forward under constant fire, each yard costing blood and breath, while corpsmen knelt in open terrain where even a helmet shadow invited bullets. Reports from frontline officers spoke of flamethrower teams advancing only to be cut down before reaching embrasures, their fuel tanks exploding under machine gun bursts. Infantry alone could not root out cave systems designed to withstand bombardment and seal themselves against grenades and satchel charges. Commanders recognized the problem with growing urgency. The enemy could not be flushed by conventional means. That realization set the stage for the arrival of armored support. Sherman tanks modified into something far more terrifying than steel and shell. The Japanese defenders, unaware of what was coming, continued to fight with grim confidence, believing the tunnels would allow them to strike, disappear, and survive. The 1st Marine Corps armored flamethrower tanks M4A3, Shermans equipped with the Navy Mark I flame system, rumbled ashore with engines growling against the black sand. These tanks, born from experimentation in the Saipan and Tinian campaigns and refined by Seabees and Marine Ordnance crews, carried the ability to project gouts of burning fuel over 100 yards. Their turrets no longer housed the familiar 75mm gun. Instead, a flamethrower nozzle replaced the coaxial machine gun, fed by pressurized fuel tanks tucked within the armored hull. The U.S. 4th and 5th Marine Divisions quickly learned how indispensable they would become. Japanese observers, hidden within volcanic casemates, initially assumed these Shermans were standard armor and prepared shaped charges, magnetic mines, and suicide anti-tank squads. But when the first jet of burning napalm arced outward with a roaring hiss and smashed into a cave mouth, everything changed. Heat rolled across the battlefield like a living force, the flame crawling into apertures, sucking oxygen from underground chambers, igniting supplies, blistering steel, and breaking the psychological armor of even the most indoctrinated troops. Survivors later whispered that nothing in their training, no fanatic oath, no samurai ideal prepared them for fire that hunted them through stone. The psychological shift spread faster than the flames themselves. Reports from Marine tank battalions recorded how Japanese machine gun nests that had held for days went silent within minutes under the assault of flame-equipped armor. Engineers and infantry coordinated movements, marking targets with smoke and radio calls, guiding the tanks forward through terrain that bogged treads and swallowed wheels. The tanks worked methodically, clearing tunnel entrances one by one, sealing them with fire and then with dozer blades as bulldozer Shermans followed behind. Some historians note that the Japanese defenders attempted desperate countermeasures, snipers targeting periscopes, mines buried deeper in volcanic ash, suicide charges launched from hidden crawl exits, but flame nullified these efforts with terrifying consistency. The sound of the tanks approached the metallic clatter of treads. The rumble echoing through subterranean spaces began to sow fear where previously only defiance lived. Men who once embraced death in battle now suffocated in darkness without the chance to strike back. The transformation of the battlefield was not merely tactical, it was spiritual, a moment where the myth of the invincible defender dissolved in incandescent reality. As the Marines pushed northward, the need for flamethrower tanks intensified. Records from Marine armor commanders indicate that by the second week of the operation, flame-equipped Shermans were requested for nearly every offensive action. The landscape itself required them. Ridges, ravines, and sulfur-stinking vents combined with fortifications that could only be neutralized through heat and suffocation. Some crews recalled that when the flame erupted, The battlefield fell eerily quiet, except for the roar of burning fuel and the collapse of structures hidden beneath the ground. Japanese diaries recovered after the battle revealed terror rarely admitted in imperial military writing. One entry described the fire as a dragon that finds the air we breathe, another as the end of all hope. Still, Kuribayashi forbade surrender. His men fought on despite the fire, despite the sealed tunnels, despite the undeniable fact that the Americans had found the weapon that defeated their strongest preparations. Yet the Marines too were changed by what they witnessed, by the smell, the screams swallowed by stone, the knowledge that inside those caves were human beings consumed in an instant. Veterans later struggled to speak about it, their voices thinning as memory returned unbidden, proving that victory can scar as deeply as loss. Flamethrower tanks became the hinge upon which the battle turned. Yet their use was never simple, never clean, never without cost. The terrain of Iwo Jima punished armor relentlessly. Volcanic ash swallowed treads and stalled momentum. Hidden mines sheared off road wheels and concealed artillery zeroed in on tank routes with uncanny accuracy. Marine after-action reports documented how crews often fought buttoned up, blind except for narrow periscope slits, relying on infantry guides who themselves moved under fire. Every advance demanded coordination: riflemen clearing satchel charge teams, engineers probing for mines, radio operators relaying target coordinates while shells burst overhead. The tanks spat flame to clear a bunker, then reversed hastily while Japanese survivors attempted last suicidal lunges. It was a choreography of survival, brutal and unrelenting. Yet for all the tactical precision, there lingered an unease among American troops. Many Marines confessed that the silence after a cave was sealed by fire haunted them more than the firefights, because the absence of sound carried an unmistakable truth: no one inside would ever emerge again. The war demanded it, the terrain forced it, but the human spirit recoiled all the same. Mount Suribachi's capture on February 23, punctuated by the iconic flag-raising recorded by Joe Rosenthal, did not mark an end to the fighting but only the conclusion of one phase of the island's agony. The north remained a labyrinth of fortified ridges. Hill 382, the amphitheater, Turkey Knob, each position, more entrenched and lethal than the last. Here, flamethrower tanks became indispensable not merely as weapons but as instruments of momentum. Marine commanders learned that infantry attacks stalled without flame support, but with it, positions that had resisted artillery barrages and naval shelling finally broke. Still, every advance exacted a price from the tank crews themselves. Japanese defenders adapted quickly, using spider holes to emerge behind advancing armor, striking at engine decks with explosives, or directing artillery fire based on the sound of engines. Tank platoon logs recorded instances where flame units were destroyed before firing a single burst, consumed not by their own weapon but by determined defenders willing to die to stop them. Yet even in these losses lay a grim truth. The Japanese had been forced from strategy into desperation, from coordinated defense into isolated sacrifice. The tanks had shifted the nature of the battle, and in doing so had altered its psychological complexion irreversibly. As the days stretched into weeks, the island became a tableau of exhaustion. Marines who had landed fresh now bore faces hollowed by sleeplessness and constant peril. Chaplains wrote of men praying not for victory but for numbness. Corpsmen described treating burns, shrapnel wounds and eyes reddened from sulfur fumes rising through fissures in the ground. The tanks continued their relentless work, burning out caves that had resisted every other tool of war. Some historians estimate that flamethrower armor was responsible for neutralizing a substantial portion of the remaining Japanese strongpoints during the battle's final phase, though exact figures vary. What is beyond dispute is that without them, the casualty lists already staggering would have been far worse. Yet numbers alone cannot convey what the men saw. The glow of flame lighting the night sky in orange pulses, ash drifting like snow, and the low rumble of engines echoing across a landscape stripped of life. Even victory felt muted, as though the island itself resisted acknowledgement. Veterans later spoke of Iwo Jima, not as a triumph, but as a weight they carried quietly, its memories sealed like the tunnels they closed with fire and stone. By early March, Kuribayashi's once formidable garrison had been reduced to scattered pockets, surviving in darkness without water, without hope of reinforcement, and without illusions. Japanese radio transmissions dwindled, reduced to fragmented messages of farewell, yet they continued to fight, emerging at night to harass American positions, dragging wounded comrades through narrow crawl spaces, and refusing surrender in adherence to the imperial code. Flamethrower tanks and demolition teams methodically sealed remaining tunnel networks, transforming defensive masterpieces into prisons. Some records suggest that a few Japanese soldiers survived for days entombed underground, unheard and unseen. Others attempted final banzai attacks, though Kuribayashi himself reportedly opposed such gestures until the very end. The last organized counterattack on March 25, led by remnants of naval construction troops and infantry stragglers, briefly overran an airfield command post before being annihilated. It was a tragic, futile eruption of defiance, a symbol of resolve but also of irreversible defeat. In the aftermath, Marines walked among the dead with a solemnity beyond anger, recognizing not just the cost of resistance but the shared humanity buried beneath ideology and fire. When Iwo Jima was finally declared secured, the toll stood stark and unforgiving. Nearly 7,000 Marines killed, tens of thousands wounded, and over 20,000 Japanese defenders dead, with only a few hundred taken prisoner. The airfields that had driven the strategic necessity of the operation soon filled with B-29 bombers making emergency landings, their crews offering silent gratitude to the men who had wrested the island from its defenders. But for those who fought, the significance of flamethrower tanks remained etched in memory not merely as machines of war but as symbols of a turning point in Pacific combat doctrine. They represented the harsh calculus of an enemy that refused surrender, of terrain that consumed infantry, and of a war that demanded solutions no matter their moral burden. Some post-war analysts argued that the tanks shortened the battle and saved thousands of American lives. Others reflected on the inescapable horror they inflicted. Both truths coexist, bound together in the volcanic rock and the unspoken recollections of survivors. In the years that followed, military historians dissected the battle's tactics. Engineers refined armored flamethrower technology, and strategists debated whether the lessons of Iwo Jima justified its cost. Yet among veterans the memory endured not as theory but as sensation. The heat of flame reflecting off tank armor, the tremor in the ground as explosions sealed another tunnel, the strange stillness that followed each assault, and the knowledge that beneath their feet lay men who had once shouted defiance and now whispered nothing. The Japanese troops were indeed shocked by America's flamethrower tanks, but the shock did not belong to them alone. The Marines, too, were marked by what they witnessed, changed by the fire they commanded and the silence it created. Wars are often remembered in flags and dates, but those who lived them recall instead the moments that refused to fade, the sound of engines, the glow of burning fuel, and the weight of understanding that no victory in such a place could ever feel clean. As the Pacific War moved on toward Okinawa and ultimately toward the end of the conflict, the legacy of Iwo Jima remained a dark and enduring chapter. Some historians claim that the island foretold the unimaginable casualties expected in an invasion of Japan's home islands, contributing to decisions that still ignite debate today. Others point to Kuribayashi's defensive strategy as a model of ingenuity, proving that even outnumbered and isolated forces could inflict profound costs through terrain, discipline, and concealment. But woven through all interpretations is the undeniable reality that flamethrower tanks shaped the battle's outcome and its memory. Their arrival marked the moment when the subterranean fortress, once thought impregnable, became vulnerable. When defenders who believed themselves shielded instead found themselves trapped. When war crossed a threshold from brutal to elemental, and long after veterans stopped speaking of it, aloud the images lived on behind closed eyes, flashes of fire, echoes of vengeance, and the quiet truth that some chapters of history endure not because they are celebrated but because they refuse to disappear. Long after the guns fell silent, the memory of Iwo Jima lingered in the minds of those who served, not as a distant campaign but as a place that reshaped their understanding of war. Veterans spoke of the island as though it was still beneath their boots, its sulfur-stained winds, its jagged terrain, and the haunting knowledge that beneath the volcanic crust lay the remains of thousands who never surfaced again. The flamethrower tanks, though celebrated in official reports for their tactical success, became symbols of a confrontation stripped of illusion. Crews recalled how heat radiated back through armor plating, how the interior air turned metallic and thick, how the periscopes fogged from reflected flame, and how their hands trembled, not from fear of enemy fire, but from what they knew was happening inside the caves they sealed. The Japanese defenders, once confident that their subterranean fortress rendered them invulnerable, were confronted with the terrible realization that the very earth they trusted had become a trap. In diaries recovered after the battle, some wrote of suffocating smoke drifting through ventilation shafts, of comrades clawing at rock as oxygen dwindled, of a sense of betrayal not by commanders but by the elements themselves. These fragments reveal a human layer often lost beneath statistics, reminding us that beneath ideology, every soldier, American or Japanese, felt the same dread when confronted with forces beyond steel and courage. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Iwo Jima marked an evolution in combat psychology. The Japanese troops, conditioned to embrace death as honorable and surrender as unthinkable, found themselves facing a weapon that denied even the chance to die in open combat. This erosion of agency inflicted a wound deeper than physical destruction. Meanwhile, American Marines who had trained to fight an enemy face-to-face were forced to confront a form of victory that felt disturbingly detached. Accounts from chaplains, officers, and enlisted men all describe a quiet reckoning and acknowledgement that survival came at the cost of witnessing destruction on a scale that defied language. Some historians suggest that the experience hardened us resolve for the battles yet to come, particularly Okinawa, where even more deeply entrenched defenses awaited. Others argue that it introduced doubts, raising questions about how far technology and necessity could override instinctive human restraint. Yet in the moment, such reflections remained unspoken, buried under the relentless momentum of war. Still, They resurfaced decades later in reunions, memoirs, and nights when sleep offered no refuge. The fire may have died, but the memory burned on. Strategists studied Iwo Jima with cold precision in the months that followed. Reports poured into the War Department, detailing fuel mixtures, projection ranges, mechanical failure rates, and optimal coordination between armor and infantry. The flamethrower tanks were refined, expanded, and prepared for use in the anticipated invasion of Japan's home islands under Operation Downfall. Simulations predicted that without such weapons, casualties would dwarf those seen on Iwo Jima and Okinawa combined. Some argued that their presence might have shattered resistance. Others insisted that nothing could have broken a population prepared for total war. These enactors reveal a harsh truth about military planning. Decisions were shaped not by emotion but by arithmetic, by the calculated balance between lives taken and lives saved. Yet beneath the charts and projections lay testimonies from the men who operated the tanks, warning that each use carried a psychological toll no manual could measure. Japanese planners, too, examined the battle with equal scrutiny, noting how their tunnel systems once believed invincible proved vulnerable to heat, smoke, and oxygen displacement. They revised defensive doctrines, expanding underground ventilation and dispersing fortifications more widely. But history would intervene before these revisions could be tested, leaving Iwo Jima as the final defining example of tunnel warfare undone by fire. As decades passed, the island transformed from battlefield to memorial. The volcanic sands, once churned by treads and boots, grew still. The airfields built under fire became silent markers of strategic necessity fulfilled. Ceremonies brought former enemies together, many of them elderly and frail, walking the same ground where youth had once been spent in ferocity. Japanese veterans bowed their heads at sealed cave entrances where comrades remained entombed. American Marines traced the outlines of ridges where friends had fallen, their memories vivid despite the years. In these moments, the flamethrower tanks returned not as engines of war but as symbols of the extremity to which both sides had been driven. Conversations unfolded slowly, haltingly, shaped by shared understanding rather than accusation. Some spoke of fear, others of duty, a few of forgiveness. The island, once defined by fire, now bore witness to reconciliation forged through silence and recognition rather than words. It stood as a reminder that history is not merely recorded in documents but carried in hearts, and that the deepest truths of war often remain unspoken. And still, the story of Iwo Jima endures taught in military academies, studied in historical works, and remembered in the quiet reflections of those who seek to understand why men fight and how they endure. The shock experienced by Japanese troops when confronted with flamethrower tanks reveals more than tactical surprise. It exposes the limits of doctrine, the fragility of conviction, and the profound impact of technology on the human psyche. It also reveals the burden carried by those who wield such power, forced to reconcile necessity with conscience. The island's legacy lies not in triumph or defeat, but in the recognition that war reshapes those who survive it, leaving marks deeper than scars. As long as history is studied and memory preserved, Iwo Jima stands as a testament to the cost of conflict etched in black sand, sealed in volcanic stone, and remembered through the voices of those who walked through fire and emerged changed forever. In the final reflections on Iwo Jima, the role of flamethrower tanks becomes inseparable from the broader evolution of warfare in the 20th century. What happened on that island was not merely a tactical adaptation, but a revelation about the changing face of combat where technology could reach into spaces once considered safe, where fortification no longer guaranteed survival, and where the psychological battlefield mattered as much as the physical one. Japanese troops, conditioned to believe that their underground redoubts rendered them beyond harm, discovered instead that fire could penetrate stone, erase oxygen, and strip away every illusion of protection. This realization spread through the ranks like a silent contagion, weakening morale even as orders demanded steadfastness. Meanwhile, American forces found themselves confronting a paradox. The very weapon that saved lives by reducing the need for repeated assaults also confronted them with scenes they could never forget. Commanders noted the effectiveness with clinical clarity, but the men who watched flame pour into caves carried a different ledger, one written in memory rather than ink. Thus, the battle revealed an uncomfortable truth that victory and trauma can arrive hand in hand, indistinguishable in the moment and inseparable in hindsight. The end of fighting on Iwo Jima did not bring immediate closure. Burial details worked for weeks, sometimes months, navigating a landscape where the dead lay above and below ground. The island's tunnels remained hazardous, filled with foul air, unexploded ordnance, and the unseen presence of those who had died out of sight. Marines reported that the silence felt heavier after the shooting stopped, as though the island itself exhaled slowly after weeks of holding its breath. Letters home struggled to convey the scale of what had occurred, often resorting to understatement rather than testimony. Japanese families received no word at all, only government notices acknowledging sacrifice without revealing circumstances. Historians would later reconstruct the battle through maps, reports, and surviving narratives, but the human texture persisted only in fragments, hesitations in a veteran's voice, pauses in interviews, moments when language faltered because memory did not. The flamethrower tanks, preserved in museums or left to rust in training yards, became artifacts that hinted at a deeper story, one that statistics could not capture and textbooks could only gesture toward. Over time, the significance of Iwo Jima reached beyond the battlefield. Pilots of crippled B-29s, landing safely on its runways after missions over Japan, recognized that their survival hinged on the sacrifice of those who had taken the island. Strategists cited the operation as justification for broader decisions, including those that ended the war in ways still debated by scholars and citizens alike. Veterans gathered in reunions where conversations circled the island like a tid approaching its memories, withdrawing from them, returning again. Some American and Japanese survivors met face to face in later years, acknowledging one another not as enemies but as men who had endured the same crucible from opposite sides. These encounters carried a quiet dignity, shaped by the understanding that war had demanded everything from them, yet life had continued despite it. The flamethrower tanks remained part of these recollections, not as instruments of hatred, but as emblems of a moment when both sides were pushed beyond the boundaries of what they once believed possible. In the end, the story of Japanese troops shocked by America's flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima is not merely a tale of weapons and tactics, nor solely of strategy and terrain. It is a story about the collision of belief and reality, about the ways technology reshapes courage and fear, and about how human beings confront forces that challenge their deepest convictions. It is about Marines advancing under fire, burdened by the knowledge that survival required actions they would remember forever. It is about Japanese defenders realizing that resolve alone could not hold back a tide of flame that flowed like liquid judgment through the tunnels they trusted with their lives. And it is about the enduring legacy of that encounter, carried not in monuments or documents but in the quiet spaces where memory resides. Iwo Jima remains a reminder that war reveals the limits of endurance, the cost of ideology, and the profound truth that even in victory, some battles never truly end.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.